Wonderful. All right. So go ahead and keep letting us know who's here as people tend to join. But we're going to get started. Today, we're going to talk about the motherhood penalty. And to guide us through this discussion, we are joined by Dr. Becky Logue-Conroy, who is a research analyst at Rutgers Center for Women and Work. Becky's work shines a light on family care decisions, paid leave policies, and the realities of childcare for working families. Her deep expertise in social work and a passion for making systems work for better families, she will bring both insight and impact to this important conversation. So please, everyone, give a warm welcome to Dr. Becky.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. I'm really excited to share some of our work with you on the motherhood penalty and to have you interact a little bit as we think about this topic and to get some questions at the end. So I'm excited for that. I am going to share my screen now. So I'll just take a second to do that. Is that good, Echo?
Looks great.
Great. So again, my name is Becky Logue-Conroy. I have a master's degree in social work and a PhD in social work. And I study family policy and the kinds of policies that help families to combine work and care across the lifespan. And so today I'm talking a little bit about the motherhood penalty. And so I'm excited to be here. And we are at the Center for Women in Work, which is housed in the School of Management and Labor Relations at Rutgers. So, what is the motherhood penalty? The motherhood penalty is the penalty experienced by working mothers that leads to lower wages or slower career advancement compared to women without children and relative to men, regardless of their parenthood status. And some of the work that we have done at the center has focused on the motherhood penalty. We did some work 2 years ago looking at the census and comparing mothers to women without children and to fathers and to men without children. And the top line pieces that we found in that study was that among all workers in New Jersey, about mothers earn about 60% of what fathers earn, and that's about a $35,000 difference in annual wages. And then among full-time workers, that gap closes a little bit. So mothers earn about 72% of what fathers earn, or a difference of about $27,000. So we see that full-time work does result in mothers earning more relative to fathers, but there's still quite a gap. So I wanted to start off by thinking about what we think could be the causes of the motherhood penalty. And so if you think about like, why might mothers make less than fathers and men without children or women without children? Why might mothers not get as much career advancement? So I was wondering if maybe people could put into the chat what they think, and I can read off the answers, and then we can talk about what the research shows. So I'm going to wait a couple seconds and see if anybody adds anything to the chat about, what you think could be possibly contributing to the motherhood penalty in New Jersey, but across the United States. Childcare. So childcare ends up being a big one, right? Because sometimes, and I'll show this later into the presentation, but families need to find childcare, right? They need to find a place for their children to go if they want to remain attached to the labor force. A belief that mothers might not be able to focus on job responsibilities, right? So maybe workplaces look at moms and say, well, I don't know, you might have to leave all the time to take care of your kids or things like that. Lack of support, lack of faith that they can focus on work solely. So that's one of those things that is just similar to the workplace one, maybe lack of support in the workplace or lack of support at home. Choice of profession, sometimes the kind of work that mothers might choose may lead to lower wages or less opportunity for career advancement. Family-friendly jobs. So if you choose a family-friendly job or don't choose a family-friendly job, sometimes family-friendly jobs end up, that's a double-edged sword, right? So it could be that a family-friendly job gives you more opportunity, but it could be that the availability of leave and flexibility and those kinds of things might end up with lower wages or less career advancement. So And then some people are saying dads feeling like they can't do the care work or can't afford to do the care work, right? So this idea of the gendered division of labor, unequal caregiving responsibilities in the family, things like that, right? So I'm going to move on, but those are some great answers to this question, right? And it's a complex issue. So we think about things like the leave taken at childbirth, right? Who's taking the longer leave at childbirth? Our mom's taking longer leave, our dad's taking longer leave. And even if you don't have access to parental leave, you might leave the workforce altogether for a little while. I left the workforce altogether for 5, 6 years until my kids went to first grade. So, that's the kind of thing that might set back your ability to get higher wages, to go to career advancement, or you might enter a PhD program like I did. Um, People saying we aren't valued enough for the services we provide. So things like that, right? So sometimes moms stay out of the workforce for the first part of their children's lives. So up to age 3, where they might have access to pre-K, or up to age 5 or 6, where kids tend to start going to school full time. So that's part of it. Workplace perception. Again, we talked about that. Are you supported in the workplace? Things like that. Changes in occupation. So someone mentioned that, the choice of profession. Occupational segregation, that's the same kind of thing, right? So like, are mothers and fathers segregated into different kinds of workplaces? Changes in work hours. Are you going from full-time work to part-time work? So those kinds of things. And so I want to talk about a little bit more about what some of the research says about this. And so I'll repeat myself a little bit, but then talk a little bit more about what kinds of things contribute to the motherhood penalty. So as people said in the chat, women are often the ones who are mothers are the ones doing the caregiving, and their labor force participation reflects that. And this might be a preference for some families. Some families may prefer to have someone stay home for the first part of babies' lives. And, while that's a preference for some families, that does then contribute to that wage penalty, or to that career advancement penalty, that motherhood penalty. At childbirth, around 19% of women exit the labor force for an extended period. So they might, again, stay out till pre-K, stay out till the beginning of kindergarten, till full-time schooling, those kinds of things. Or they might reduce their work to part-time. And mothers are more likely to do that than fathers. And again, just like people mentioned, in families where there's a gender division of labor, the care work may fall to mothers, and they may choose to change their work hours accordingly, right? So they might be the ones who get called in the middle of the day. They might need more flexibility to, again, leave the workplace at the beginning of the day, things like that. And we also find sometimes that families tag team their care, right? So maybe one person works during the day and one person works overnight, so that there's always someone there to care. But if you're choosing a job by the work hours, sometimes the choices are not as broad as you might choose if you were just doing the job that you've wanted to do all the time, right? So you might choose a job in a warehouse, or choose a job as a night shift manager, things like that, that maybe would result in lower wages or less opportunity for career advancement. And then really single mothers have a really complex set of choices, right? They are often the sole caregivers, so they have to think about how much care they can give, but they also might be the sole breadwinners. And so they have to think about how to balance that care work and, providing financially for their families. And so their choices are sometimes constrained by their access to care and access to work. So they're a special, we need to think especially about the kinds of parents who might need to balance those things. And then we see that there are workplace factors. Women who have access to more flexible hours are more likely to return to work after childbirth. And sometimes the people who have access to that flexibility are people in higher paying jobs. And so if you don't have access to flexibility, or if you have a lower paying job, you might experience that motherhood penalty because you don't have the opportunity to go back to a job with that kind of flexibility. Some people talked about this in the chat. Some workplaces continue to rely on this idea of an ideal worker norm. So that means they expect workers to work long hours and to not think about having family at home. And some workplaces perceive that men are more likely to fit that ideal. And someone said that in the chat, people don't necessarily think of mothers as committed to the work. And that is something that persists in workplaces still, even as men are taking longer leaves, who are participating in more childcare as they did typically, maybe in the U.S. history. It's still potentially a perception that remains in the workplace. And workplaces may prioritize men for promotions or advancement because they perceive that mothers are more likely to be caregiving, and that this ideal worker norm or this gender division of care and labor. Sometimes workplaces see fathers as the ones providing the care. I mean, providing the breadwinning, right? So providing the money, and then moms are providing the care. So maybe the workplaces are compensating people in that way. And then finally, there are policy issues, right? So access to paid leave may allow mothers to remain attached to the labor force because they may feel that they can take leave and then go back to their job if their job is protected, and those kinds of things. But there aren't that many states that have access to paid leave. New Jersey is one of them. And then there's no national access to paid leave, right? So in some places, it might be easier for moms to leave the workforce for some period of time rather than try to figure out how to take leave and how to have their job protected. In addition, access to childcare allows more women to remain attached to the labor force. If a family doesn't have access to the kind of childcare they want, they may be more inclined to have the mother stay out of the workforce for a longer period. And as I said before, they may choose to tag team, trade work hours with the other parent. If they can't afford childcare, if they don't have access to affordable childcare that they really want to send their kids to, they may choose to share care in this way. And so I want to talk a little bit about the work that we've done in New Jersey. We did a little bit of work looking at the census and looking at how the motherhood penalty plays out in New Jersey. So I want to show you a couple of slides about the kind of things that we've done to look at New Jersey. So this chart, I'll explain, is really very interesting. What we see as the baseline, the $0, is men with no children. That doesn't mean they make $0. That's just kind of like the baseline we're using to show whether someone has a penalty compared to men with no children or a premium compared to men with no children. So we see that women, both mothers and non-mothers, experience a penalty related to men with no children. So mothers experience a $25,000 annual penalty. Women with no children actually are very close to that. So we see that there's a gender penalty, but mothers experience an even bigger penalty. But at the same time, fathers experience a wage premium in New Jersey. So we see that fathers actually make more than men with no children and way more than mothers, right? So if we think about why that might happen, does anybody have any thoughts about why we see fathers experience a wage premium or a career advancement premium? I mean, I hinted at it a little bit in my previous, but does anybody have any thoughts about why that would occur? I'm just going to take a few seconds. The assumption that they're breadwinners, right? Belief that men will prioritize work. Men are seen as providers. Some men work more while moms stay home, right? So these are the kinds of things that may result in things that aren't necessarily conscious to the workplace, but people experience them. That they seem to tend to view as having more responsibilities and more expenses, right? Fathers might be seen as this ideal worker. What's interesting too is that some research I've seen has shown that men talk about being parents more because women are afraid that they're going to experience that motherhood penalty. They've observed that in their friends or in themselves in other workplaces. And they tend not to talk about their kids and still experience that motherhood penalty. But somehow fathers talk about being a dad, and that actually might lead to workplaces paying them more or feeling like, oh gosh, we have to be sure that this person can support their family if we know they have a family. Whereas they don't see that, paradoxically, they don't see that in the same way for working moms. So that's something we see in the data and in some of the research. So that's really an interesting piece of the puzzle. What we also see in New Jersey is that there are different places in New Jersey where both parents work, both parents are in the labor force versus, both parents not being in the labor force. So this map kind of shows New Jersey and where there are places where there are more families where both parents are in the labor force. So this shows of all the families that have children living with both parents, the darker shaded ones are where we have the highest labor force participation of both parents. So we see up in the top left corner, that's Warren County. We see Burlington County. We see Camden County in South Jersey. Those are the ones that have the highest labor force participation of both parents. And then the lighter shaded counties like Ocean County and Cape May County have fewer percent of families where both parents are in the labor force. So these are some of the places where people might be choosing to both be in the labor force, but it also might be places where there are economic circumstances that lead to fewer opportunities for both parents to be in the labor force. So this is a combination probably of the choice of families, but also what the opportunities are for both parents to be in the labor force. And you'd think that might be reflective of where there might be more of a wage gap or a wage penalty or a motherhood penalty, but actually it's a little bit different where the wage penalties are. And this might just be where there are the kinds of jobs that parents have similar wages or not similar wages, right? So we see the highest motherhood penalty in Monmouth County, in Hunterdon County, in Sussex County, and we see the lowest motherhood penalty in Essex County, Passaic County, and Union County. So there might be more access to the kinds of jobs that pay more in some of these lower penalty counties, like management, those kinds of things. There might be, different kinds of occupational segregation in these different counties. So it's just something to think about that, even in one state across different areas, people experience these kinds of things differently. So when we think about policy or when we think about ways to maybe change the way that we do things, we have to think about the ways in which different kinds of people experience these situations differently. So I want to go back to some of the possible solutions to this, to the motherhood penalty. And when we think about possible solutions, we think about potentially individual solutions versus structural solutions. And that happens a lot in policy, where we think about different ways that individuals can act that might change their circumstances. But we also think about whether there are structural solutions that might change the circumstance for many more people at once. So when we look at individual solutions, maybe there's a way to increase the amount of paternity leave that dads take, right? If dads take paternity leave, at the same rate as moms take maternity leave, if they take parental leave at the same rates, could that help to close that gap a little bit, to not have mothers seen as the only ones doing the care? That might be a possible solution. Maybe the length of the absence that moms take. If they take a shorter absence, if they take 12 weeks versus a year versus 2 years versus 3 years, does that give them more opportunity for advancement and for changes in wages? Choice of occupation, is there a point at which, moms could choose different occupations or dads can choose different occupations that make things a little bit more egalitarian, those kinds of things, right? So we think about the division of household labor. In more egalitarian households, does that motherhood penalty decrease because dads are doing a lot more of the care work, those kinds of things, right? But then we also think about structural solutions. Can we find ways to incentivize men to do more care, to take more leave? Where there are higher wage replacements for paid family leave, dads are more likely to take that leave. We might think about changing that idea of the ideal worker norm and see caregiving as something that everybody does, that is the responsibility of more people. And therefore, that idea is not gendered. We might change leave policies. If someone can receive a portion of their pay while on leave, they might trust that their job is there for them when they return, and they may be more inclined to remain attached to their job. And then childcare policies, right? So some people mention childcare. I'm sure, there are a lot of people who think a lot about childcare on this call. And that can also contribute. The ways that we design childcare policies could help families in this way. Families, if they're able to afford childcare that works well for their family schedule, may be more likely to have both parents remain in the labor force, and then may reduce that childcare, that motherhood penalty. And so before I get to the question piece, I just want to talk a little bit about what we've talked about today. I've gone through it a little bit quickly. I didn't do a lot of statistics, but I just want to talk about, we think about the causes of the motherhood penalty, and we think about, maybe there are individual preferences, or maybe there are structural issues that are there. Maybe there's discrimination against mothers, right? We see that there are a lot of different pieces to this. And here in New Jersey, families, do have access to paid family leave. There's some level of childcare subsidies. And so some portion of families can access childcare subsidies. But if we go back to our theories about why the motherhood penalty exists, there is some research that the biggest portion of that penalty really is on the workplace side, not on the individual choice side, that men continue to be seen as the ones who are the breadwinners. And so men continue to be given those kinds of premiums and opportunity for advancement, where they have that causes that penalty to build and build and build. But it really is complex. It's a complex topic. The penalties result from structural factors that aren't just about gender, right? We're talking about a motherhood penalty, so we're speaking in these gendered ways, but it's about race, it's about class, it's about education and occupation. Black women have a long history of being attached to the labor force, and we know that. And so the issues are a little bit different for people who've been attached to the labor force for their history, caring for other people's children, versus like how we talk about the return to the labor force or the increase in labor force participation of white middle class women. And so the ways that we think about policy and the ways that we think about structure, really we have to think about those things like race and class. People who have access to higher paying jobs have access to paid leave at work, might have access to childcare at work, might have access to more flexible workplaces. But people in lower wage jobs, they might not have that same kind of access. So we have to think about that as well. And that might lead to, a further separation of that motherhood penalty. So it's a really complex problem. And some people might not see it as a problem. Some families, some lawmakers, some researchers, they might say, yeah, there's a motherhood penalty because mothers do the care work. And what is the purpose of thinking about this as a problem, thinking about the kinds of solutions? But for many families, they need to have both people in the labor force. So we need to think about ways to ensure that families are able to care and work so that their families can thrive. And that's why I really like doing this research and why it's so important to keep thinking about these questions. When we do this research, we try to look at complex problems from all of these different angles and try to look for new ways to understand complex issues. And when we do presentations like this to a bigger audience, it gets more people thinking about the issue and thinking about the ways in which families care and work. And it gives more opportunity for people to think of really clever or complex solutions, and ways to ensure that families are able to care and work in the ways that they want, that's right for their family. So I really appreciate you giving me the time today. These are some of the references that I used, but I'm happy to take questions now. I think there might be some questions in the Q&A box, but I'm excited to hear what people's thoughts.